Morning light slid through the glass walls of Crow Tower, turning the marble lobby into something cold and unforgiving. Elena Morales stood outside the penthouse conference room with her hands folded the way she always did when she wanted to disappear. Inside, Alexander Crow sat at the head of the table, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. Beside him were the head of human resources and the operations manager folders, aligned screens glowing procedure, ready to be followed. Elena was called in without explanation. The door closed behind her with a sound that felt final. Alexander did not look at her at first. He reviewed a security report, spoke in a calm, professional tone, and explained that she had violated a restricted access rule by entering the penthouse after hours. The HR director confirmed the clause. The operations manager nodded. The decision was lawful, documented, and clean. Elena listened without interrupting. She had broken a rule. That was true. What no one asked was why. Alexander finally looked up and met her eyes with practiced distance. Effective immediately, her contract was terminated. Security would escort her out. The words landed with precision and no mercy. Elena felt the room tilt, but she kept her voice steady and thanked them for their time. As she turned to leave, Alexander stood to sign the termination form. His hand paused when Elena stepped closer, not to plead, not to argue, but to do something small and instinctive. She reached out and straightened his tie, smoothing the fabric the way she had done once before in another life. She placed his coffee on the table exactly where he always reached for it, without looking angled, just enough to avoid the glare. Alexander noticed the movement but dismissed it as coincidence. He had trained himself to ignore patterns that belonged to the past. Elena saw that dismissal and felt something inside her fold in on itself. Years of careful distance of watching him become someone untouchable collapsed into a quiet ache. She realized then that to him she was invisible, a function, a problem to be removed. She stepped back, her throat tight, her heart strangely calm. The room waited for her to leave. Instead, Elena leaned in, just enough that only Alexander could hear her. Her voice was soft, steady, and devastating. "You promised me you would never become this man," she whispered, and then she said the name he had buried so deeply that even he pretended it had never existed. The effect was immediate and violent. Alexander froze. His pen slipped from his fingers and clattered against the table. His breath caught as if the air had been punched from his lungs. The HR director looked up in confusion. The operations manager asked if everything was all right. Alexander could not answer. The name echoed inside his chest, dragging with it a night he had sworn to erase a version of himself he had killed to survive. His hands trembled. The room seemed too bright, too loud, too present. Elna watched his control fracture for the first time since she had known him. She did not stay to see the damage spread. She turned and walked out, escorted by security, through corridors she had cleaned in silence for years. Behind her, Alexander finally found his voice raw and unguarded. He said her name not as an order, not as a dismissal, but as a question. "How do you know that name?" Elena did not answer. The elevator doors closed and carried her downward away from glass and power and the man who no longer remembered how to be human. As she descended, memories pressed in unwanted but persistent of a different morning years ago, when he had been sitting on the edge of a borrowed bed shaking, convinced he had ruined everything he touched. She had tied his shoes that day, because his hands would not stop trembling. She had told him his name mattered because it belonged to a man who still cared. That was the name she had just given back to him like a blade. In the penthouse, Alexander remained standing, aware of eyes on him, but unable to return to the mask that had protected him for so long. The HR director cleared her throat and suggested a pause. The operations manager asked if medical assistance was needed. Alexander waved them away, his vision narrowing, his pulse loud in his ears. He saw Elena as she had been before money, before control, before the silence he had chosen over love. The rule he had enforced so cleanly suddenly felt irrelevant, a thin excuse for a cruelty he could not name. Somewhere deep inside him, something he had locked away began to break. And he was afraid of it. Elena Morales did not cry. When the elevator reached the lobby, she waited until she stepped outside Crow Tower and felt the city air touch her face before she let herself breathe again. She had known this day might come, not the firing, not the humiliation, but the moment when she would no longer be able to stay invisible. She had recognized Alexander Crow the first morning she reported for her housekeeping shift 3 years earlier. He had stepped out of the private elevator, taller than she remembered, sharper at the edges, wrapped in an expensive suit, and a reputation that made people straighten their backs. Everyone else saw a billionaire. Elena saw the man who once sat on a kitchen floor, with his head in his hands, whispering that he did not want to exist anymore. She had almost dropped the linen cart that day. Instead, she lowered her eyes and memorized the way he walked the way. He avoided looking at anyone directly the way he carried control like armor. She told herself she would leave. She told herself she would not stay, but she stayed. Not because she wanted something from him, and not because she believed in fate. She stayed because she loved him in a way that did not demand to be seen. Elena learned his routines quickly. She learned which mornings he skipped breakfast and which nights he slept in the office. She learned the signs of his exhaustion long before his assistants did. When the building went quiet after midnight, she made sure the lights in his hallway were dimmed, just enough to ease the pressure behind his eyes. She adjusted the thermostat because she remembered he always ran cold when he was anxious. She did these things without expectation. Loving him quietly was safer than reminding him of a past he had buried. Sometimes she wondered if he ever felt her presence at all. There were moments when he paused in a doorway or glanced down a corridor as if something familiar brushed against him. Elena would step back into the shadows and wait for the feeling to pass. She did not want to be a ghost that haunted him. She wanted to be the reason he could breathe. The memory of who he had been came to her in fragments she never invited. A cheap diner at 2 a.m, where he pushed his fries toward her because he had lost his appetite. The way he smiled without effort back then, like smiling did not cost him anything. The night he told her his real name, not as an introduction, but as a confession. He had said it like it was something fragile, something that could be taken from him if spoken too loudly. Elena had promised she would never use it against him. She had kept that promise for years. When she became his maid, she understood the irony of it immediately. The woman who knew him best was now paid to erase her presence. She accepted the uniform, the badge, the rules. She accepted being unseen because it meant she could stay. Every day she chose silence again. The choice was not noble, It was necessary. She knew what would happen if he remembered who he had been with her. He would feel the weight of everything he had abandoned to become the man the world respected. Elna did not want to be the reason he broke. That morning when security flagged her entry to the penthouse, she knew the rules had finally caught up with her. She had gone upstairs because she saw his office light still on long after midnight and remembered the way his hands used to shake when he pushed himself too far. She told herself she was just doing her job. She told herself it was nothing. Standing in the conference room, listening to the termination read aloud, Elena felt something settle inside her. She could have left quietly. She could have kept the promise forever. But when she saw him look at her like a stranger, when she saw that he no longer recognized even the smallest part of what they had shared, something in her refused to disappear again. The whisper was not revenge. It was not a demand. It was an act of love sharp enough to cut through the man he had become. As she walked away from the tower, Elena understood what the cost would be. She had given him back the truth and lost her place near him forever. The question that followed her down the street was not whether she had done the right thing. It was whether loving someone meant letting them forget you completely or letting them remember and suffer. For the first time since she put on that uniform, Elena was no longer hiding, and she did not know if she was strong enough for what came next. Alexander Crow stood alone in his office long after everyone else had left the city, stretched beneath him like something unreal. The name still echoed in his body, not as a sound, but as a physical response he could not control. His pulse had not slowed. His hands were unsteady. He loosened his collar and leaned both palms against the glass. Breathing through the tightness in his chest, he had built his life on discipline, on control, on the ability to sever emotion the moment it threatened to interfere. Yet one whispered name had undone years of careful construction. He tried to tell himself it was coincidence that Elena had overheard something that it meant nothing. The lie collapsed immediately. No one used that name. No one was supposed to know it existed. His reflection in the window looked older than he remembered, harder, like a man carved out of necessity instead of hope. He pressed his fingers to his sternum and waited for the shaking to stop. It did not. The memory came without permission, dragging him backward into a night he had spent years pretending belonged to someone else. It had been raining the kind of rain that felt relentless, unforgiving. He remembered sitting alone in a borrowed apartment with the lights off the walls closing, in the sense that he had failed at everything that mattered. His phone had buzzed with messages he could not bring himself to answer. His future felt like a weight pressing down on his lungs. That was the night he decided the man he was could not survive. The name he had been born with carried too much softness, too much vulnerability. He believed killing it was the only way forward. He remembered standing in the bathroom, staring at his own face, practicing the sound of the new name until it felt sharp enough to protect him. He remembered the relief that followed the emptiness that made functioning possible. Becoming Alexander Crow had saved his life. It had also cost him something he could never name without breaking. Elena had been there that night, not to rescue him, not to offer solutions, but to witness. She had sat on the floor across from him, knees pulled to her chest, listening as he spoke in fragments, admitting fears he never allowed himself to feel in daylight. She had not told him to be strong. She had not told him everything would be fine. She had simply stayed. When he told her the name he was about to abandon, his voice shaking, she had nodded as if accepting something sacred. She had promised never to speak it unless he asked. That promise had been a lifeline. He carried it with him when he left, when he cut contact, when he built an empire on the version of himself that did not feel. For years the memory stayed buried, locked behind work and ambition. Seeing Elena again should have been impossible. He had told himself she belonged to a chapter he no longer allowed himself to read. Yet there she was, moving quietly through his world, carrying his past with her without demanding recognition. The realization struck him with brutal clarity. She had known him the entire time. While he curated power and distance, she had watched him from the margins, protecting the man he no longer remembered how to be. The name was not just a word. It was a wound he had chosen to cauterize by force. Hearing it spoken again felt like reopening flesh he thought had healed. Alexander sank into his chair, head in his hands, the control he valued slipping through his fingers. He understood then that firing her had not been an act of authority. It had been an act of fear, and fear once named was no longer something he could outrun. Elena had learned early that silence could be an act of love. She learned it the night Alexander asked her to make a promise that felt heavier than any vow. They were sitting on the edge of that borrowed bed, the rain still tapping the windows, his hands clasped together as if holding himself in place. He told her he was going to change his name, his life, everything about himself that still felt breakable. He told her that if anyone ever spoke the old name aloud, he would fall apart, and that he could not afford to fall apart again. Elena did not argue. She did not ask him to stay. She nodded and said she understood, because understanding him was easier than saving him. When she promised to keep the name quiet, she meant it with her whole heart. Over the years that followed, she carried that promise like something fragile she protected from the world. She watched from a distance as he disappeared into success, his face appearing on screens and magazines under a name that fit him like armor. Every time she saw it, she reminded herself that the man she loved was still alive inside him, even if no one else could see it. When she took the job at Crow Tower, she did it knowing the risk. She told herself she would leave if he recognized her. She told herself she would leave if the silence became unbearable. Instead, the silence became a way of staying close without demanding anything. She cleaned rooms he never noticed, learned the rhythms of a building designed to make people feel small, and kept her promise one day at a time. There were moments when the urge to speak nearly broke her. Nights when she heard him pacing in his office, long after everyone else had gone home, the tension in his shoulders unmistakable. Mornings when his voice sounded tight during meetings, the same tone he used years ago when fear pressed too hard against his ribs. Elena swallowed the name, then held it back, and reminded herself that love did not always mean intervening. Sometimes it meant restraint. Sometimes it meant choosing his safety over her need to be seen. She stayed quiet when he passed her in the hallway without recognition. She stayed quiet when she saw him flinch at kindness offered by people who wanted something in return. She stayed quiet when she realized that the man he had become relied on her silence to keep functioning. Breaking the promise would not have brought him comfort. It would have forced him to confront a version of himself he had built his life avoiding. Elena believed that if she loved him, she had to respect the choices he made to survive. That belief was tested the morning she was called to the penthouse. Standing outside the conference room, she felt the weight of years pressing against her chest. She knew the rules she had broken were real. She also knew why she had broken them. He had looked exhausted the night before, the kind of exhaustion that went beyond lack of sleep. It was the exhaustion she recognized as dangerous. She went upstairs because loving him had never been neat or safe. In the conference room, as the decision was read aloud, Elena felt the promise tighten around her throat. She could leave without speaking. She could protect him one last time. But when he looked at her with complete indifference, something shifted. The silence that had once felt like devotion now felt like erasure. He was not choosing safety anymore. He was choosing to forget. The promise had been meant to protect a man who wanted to live. It was never meant to protect a man who no longer remembered why living mattered. Elena understood then that keeping quiet had become another way of abandoning him. She broke the promise not to hurt him, but to reach him. The name was a key she had kept hidden until the moment he could no longer be reached any other way. Whispering it was not an act of betrayal, it was an act of truth. As she walked away, she accepted the consequence of that choice. She would lose her job, her proximity, her quiet way of loving him. But she would give him back the one thing he had lost the right to ignore. The man he had been, the man he still was beneath the armor, deserved to be seen, even if it cost her everything. She did not know if he would ever thank her or forgive her or even understand what she had done. She only knew that loving him had always meant choosing the harder truth over the easier silence. As she rode the bus home, watching the city blur past the window, Elena allowed herself to remember the small hopes she had buried. The hope that one day he would look at her and see recognition instead of emptiness. The hope that the name would no longer be a wound but a bridge. She pressed her palm against the glass and let the future remain uncertain because uncertainty was still more honest than pretending she had never mattered at all. Her phone vibrated with a message from a supervisor acknowledging the termination, the language polite and final. Elena deleted it without replying. She thought of the years ahead of work that would be harder and days that would be lonelier, and she accepted them as the price of telling the truth. Somewhere above the streets, Alexander was sitting with the wreckage of a life he thought was stable. She did not wish him pain, but she did not wish him numbness either. If the name opened a door he had locked, then suffering was only the first step toward something real. Elena closed her eyes and breathed steady and unafraid, knowing that whatever happened next, she had finally stopped hiding. The promise had shaped her life, but breaking it had given her back her voice. She stood when the bus stopped, stepped into the noise of the city, and chose to walk forward without looking back at the tower. Love had never asked her to be small. It had only asked her to be brave. And bravery, she knew, would have to be enough for both of them now. Even if it meant loving him from a distance, she could finally survive. And trusting that the truth would find its way back to her when the time was right for both. Before power found them, love had no name and no future, only presence. They met when life felt temporary, when plans changed weekly, when hope was something you borrowed and returned without interest. Alexander was not a billionaire, then not a leader, not a man others watched with careful respect. He was tired, uncertain, and painfully aware of how easily things fell apart. Elena did not ask him who he wanted to become. She only asked who he was when no one else was looking. They talked late into nights, sitting on borrowed furniture, sharing food that tasted better because it was shared. There were no promises because neither of them trusted tomorrow enough to name it. Love arrived quietly, without claims, without rules, without the expectation that it would last. It existed in small moments, in the way she listened when he spoke, and the way he looked at her like she mattered even when nothing else did. On the night everything changed, there was no dramatic argument, no raised voices, no shattered illusions. There was only the quiet realization that loving each other did not make the world gentler. Alexander sat on the edge of the bed, shoulders hunched, staring at the floor, as if answers might appear there. Elena sat beside him, close enough to feel his fear, far enough to let him breathe. They did not hold each other at first because fear needed space before comfort could follow. When they finally touched, it was tentative, almost uncertain, as if both understood that this closeness might be the last. Elena rested her head against his, listening to his heartbeat steady and fragile at the same time. She did not ask him to stay because she sensed the decision forming inside him like a storm. Alexander believed love should save him, and when it did not, he assumed love had failed. He did not understand then that love had already done its work by showing him who he was. In the morning, light crept into the room, revealing the truth neither of them wanted to say aloud. He would leave not because he did not care, but because caring felt like a risk he could not survive. Elena understood this without forgiving it, because love did not erase hurt, it only explained it. They shared a final meal, simple and unremarkable, talking about nothing important because the important things were already decided. There was laughter, soft and brief, the kind that comes when you know you are losing something precious. When Alexander stood to leave, Elena did not stop him, even though every instinct urged her to speak. She let him go because claiming him would have turned love into a prison. At the door he looked back, hesitation flickering across his face, and for a moment she thought he might stay. He did not, and she did not follow, and the silence that settled between them became the shape of their future. Years later, as Elena moved through Crow Tower, that silence walked beside her, familiar and heavy. She remembered this love not as a tragedy, but as something honest that had existed without ownership. It was love that did not demand a ring, a title, or a promise. It asked only that they see each other clearly, for the brief time they were brave enough to try. When she straightened his tie in the conference room, it was not habit but memory. When she placed his coffee just right, it was not service but love that had never asked for anything back. The firing did not erase that love, it only confirmed how far he had traveled from it. As Elena rode the bus away from the tower, she accepted that their story had never been meant to be owned. It belonged to a time when they were both unprotected, when love was chosen without witnesses. She did not regret it even now, because loving him that way had taught her who she was. What she wondered as the city passed by was whether he would ever remember that love was never meant to be possessed. Somewhere above the streets, Alexander was learning the same lesson, though neither of them knew it yet. A love without claim does not disappear. It waits patient and unyielding for the moment truth makes room. That truth had begun with a whisper, and it would continue, whether either of them were ready or not. Elena closed her eyes and leaned her head against the window, letting the memory settle without fear. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to miss him openly, without shame or apology. She had loved him when he was kind, when he was lost, and when he was afraid. That love did not vanish because he changed it, simply changed her. It taught her that real connection did not come from certainty, but from the courage to be seen. If Alexander ever came back to that truth, it would not be because she asked him to. It would be because he chose it, and choice was the only thing love respected. As the bus stopped, Elena stood steady and certain that whatever followed, she had already lived honestly. That knowledge felt like a quiet strength she could carry forward, even if the path ahead was unclear. She stepped onto the sidewalk, the noise of the city wrapping around her, and kept walking. Love without claim had shaped her, and it would not leave her now. It was not a wound, but a foundation she would build on. And somewhere behind glass and power, the man she loved was beginning to understand what he had lost. That understanding would not come gently, but love had never promised gentleness. It had only promised truth, and truth once spoken could not be undone. Elena welcomed whatever came next, knowing that loving him without claim had been the bravest thing she had ever done. It was a love that asked nothing and gave everything, even when the cost was separation. That was why it endured quiet and intact beneath the noise of ambition and regret. As the day unfolded, Elena carried that endurance with her, unaware of how soon it would be tested. For now the past rested waiting for the moment it would demand an answer. And somewhere above the city, a man who had buried a name was beginning to remember why it mattered. Love without claim does not fade. It simply waits for courage to catch up. That moment was coming whether he wanted. Elena left Crow Tower through the service exit because that was how the system worked. Quiet doors, for quiet people, paths designed to erase you without ceremony. The service elevator descended slowly, its mirrored walls reflecting a version of herself. She barely recognized still in uniform hands. Steady face composed. No one spoke. The guard avoided her eyes. When the doors opened to the underground corridor, she stepped out without hesitation, walking past storage rooms and humming machines that had never noticed her either. Outside the city moved on as if nothing had happened. Traffic surged, phones rang, lives continued. Elena stood on the sidewalk for a moment, absorbing the strange weightlessness of being cut loose. She felt fear, but beneath it was relief, sharp and unexpected. She no longer had to pretend she was invisible. Meanwhile, Alexander returned to his office and tried to resume the day he had interrupted. Meetings restarted, screens filled with data. Assistants spoke to him in careful tones. He responded on instinct, approving numbers, issuing instructions, maintaining the image he had perfected. The company ran smoothly because it always did. Power did not pause for guilt. Yet something had shifted. The chair felt wrong beneath him. The room felt too quiet, as if the walls were waiting for him to acknowledge what he had done. He caught himself glancing toward the door she had walked through his chest, tightening each time. He opened a document and stared at it without comprehension. The name Elena had spoken lingered beneath every thought, dragging with it memories he had never allowed himself to examine in daylight. He told himself this discomfort would pass, that discipline had always been enough before. But guilt did not respond to discipline. It followed him persistent and patient. He worked late longer than usual, pushing himself to exhaustion, because exhaustion had always been a reliable distraction. When night fell and the building emptied, the quiet pressed closer. He stood and walked the corridors without purpose, his steps echoing. He passed areas Elena used to clean after hours, noticing details he had never cared to see. The way the lights softened along the walls, the faint scent of citrus cleaner that made the space feel human. He realized with a jolt that these comforts had been hers gifts she left behind without asking to be noticed. The realization made his throat tighten. He returned to his office and sat head in his hands, the authority he wielded all day, feeling suddenly fragile. Down on the street, Elena waited for the bus, watching reflections of the tower ripple across passing cars. She told herself not to look up, but habit was hard to break. The glass rose above her like a reminder of a life she had brushed against but never entered. She wondered if he was standing at one of those windows, unaware that power could not keep guilt from finding him. When the bus arrived, she boarded and took a seat by the window, her thoughts quieter now, that the choice was no longer hers to postpone. Alexander finally did what he had not allowed himself to do all day. He opened his laptop and searched her name. Not the version on the termination form, but the name she had once used when she trusted him. Nothing appeared, no records, no trace. The absence felt intentional. He closed the laptop and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. For the first time, he considered that she might be gone for good, not just from the building, but from his reach. The idea unsettled him more than any market risk ever had. He stood again and moved toward the elevators, then stopped. His hand hovered near the button, uncertain. He could call HR. He could reverse the decision. He could do something decisive. Instead, he stepped back. The crack had formed, but fear still held him in place. He told himself he would think clearly in the morning. Elena got off the bus several stops later and walked the rest of the way home, her pace steady. She unlocked her door and stepped into the small apartment she had arranged, carefully every object chosen for function, not comfort. She sat at the table and let the silence settle. Losing the job would make things harder. She knew that. But the thought of returning to that tower, of continuing to love him quietly, while he forgot her completely, felt impossible now. Across the city, Alexander remained awake, the glow of the skyline mocking his restlessness. Power had fired her. Guilt was beginning to chase him. And for the first time since he had built his empire, he was not sure which one would win. The night Alexander ran was quiet in the way that made decisions feel permanent. He stood in his office with the city glowing beneath him, jacket still on, lights dimmed, knowing that if he stayed even one more minute, he would do something he could not undo. The name Elena had spoken had cracked something open, and inside that crack lived every fear he had ever avoided. He told himself that running had always worked before. When he left the man he had been behind, he survived. When he chose ambition over closeness, he succeeded. Leaving was not cowardice, it was strategy. That was the story he had lived by. He shut down his computer, ignoring unread messages, and took the elevator down alone. The building felt different at night, less impressive, more exposed. In the lobby, his reflection followed him across polished stone, a man who looked certain even when his thoughts were anything but. Outside, the air was cool and sharp. He did not look back at the tower. Looking back had never helped. He walked until the noise of traffic blurred into something distant, his phone heavy in his pocket. Elena had never asked him to stay. That was the part that hurt the most. He remembered the night years ago when leaving had felt necessary, when loving her had scared him more than losing her. He had told himself then that survival required distance, that attachment made him weak. That belief had carried him far, but it had also hollowed him out. Now faced with the truth she had given him, he chose the familiar escape. He ran because staying meant facing the man he had erased. Elena felt the loss before she understood it. Sitting in her apartment, listening to the hum of the city outside, she sensed something shifting, like a door closing somewhere far away. She did not know where Alexander was or what he was doing, but she knew his pattern. When fear caught up with him, he disappeared. She had lived through that disappearance once before. It had taught her how to let go without bitterness. She made herself dinner and ate slowly, grounding herself in routine. Loving him had never been about control. It had always been about acceptance. If he chose to run again, she would not chase him. That lesson had cost her too much to forget. Alexander drove without a destination, the road stretching ahead of him like a promise of anonymity. The farther he went, the easier it became to breathe. He convinced himself that distance would dull the ache that time would restore order. Yet every mile carried Elena with him, not as an accusation, but as a reminder of something he had once valued more than success. He pulled over near the river and stepped out of the car, staring at the dark water. The urge to call her rose sharp and insistent. He imagined her voice steady and warm and felt his resolve waver. Calling would mean admitting he was afraid. It would mean asking for something he did not know how to receive. He put the phone away. Running was simpler. Back in her apartment, Elena stood at the window and watched the lights of the city pulse. She thought of the man she loved not as he was now, but as he had been when he believed love could save him. She allowed herself to grieve quietly without drama, because grief did not need witnesses. She understood that his choice to run was not about her worth. It was about his fear of needing anyone at all. That knowledge softened the pain without erasing it. Alexander returned home near dawn exhaustion, settling into his bones. He lay on the bed without sleeping, replaying moments he had buried for years. Elena tying his shoes, Elena listening without judgment, Elena choosing silence to protect him. Each memory tightened around his chest, making escape feel less effective than it once had. He had chosen to live instead of love, but the cost of that choice was no longer theoretical. It was real and immediate. As the sky lightened, he realized that running had not freed him. It had only delayed the reckoning. Across the city, Elena prepared for the day ahead, her movements calm, her heart steady. She did not know if Alexander would ever find the courage to return to what he had abandoned. She only knew that she would not make herself smaller to make his fear easier. The night he ran became another turning point, not because of where it took him, but because of what it revealed. He had run before and survived. This time survival felt empty, and somewhere deep inside a question began to form, one he could no longer outrun. Did living without love still count as living at all? Alexander began searching the morning after he realized running had failed him, and the first thing he did was strip himself of the tools he always used to solve problems. He did not call his assistants. He did not involve legal or security. He did not use databases that could surface a life in seconds. He walked the city instead, starting with places that did not belong to him. He returned to the block where she once lived years ago, only to find a different name on the mailbox and a lock he had no right to open. He went to the diner that stayed open too late and charged too little, the one where they had shared fries at 2 in the morning, and learned it had closed during the winter. He asked questions without introducing himself, listening to polite shrugs and the kind of answers people gave when they did not owe you anything. For the first time in years, no one moved out of his way. No one recognized him. The anonymity unsettled him and steadied him at the same time. Elena spent her days moving forward, sending applications, picking up temporary shifts, keeping her head down. She did not expect him to look for her. Expectation had been the thing she learned to live without. Still, there were moments when she felt a familiar presence nearby, a sensation like a memory brushing past her shoulder. She dismissed it and kept working. Love did not grant access, it granted honesty. Alexander followed leads that led nowhere. He knocked on doors that stayed closed. He left messages that were never returned. Each rejection chipped away at the certainty he had worn like a shield. He began to understand how fragile effort felt when it was not reinforced by power. In the evenings, he sat on benches and watched people pass, noticing how easily the world continued without him at the center. The city did not bend to his urgency. It asked him to wait. Elna noticed the waiting too. On her walk home one night, she paused at a crosswalk and felt an almost meeting slip past her like a thread pulled just out of reach. She turned and saw only strangers. She told herself that almost was still distance, and distance was necessary. Alexander arrived at a community center she once volunteered at, only to learn she had stopped coming months earlier. He thanked the receptionist and stepped outside, the frustration finally breaking through his composure. He leaned against the brick wall and closed his eyes, aware that he had no one to blame but himself. Searching without power meant accepting refusal without appeal. It meant being patient when patience hurt. Days passed this way, marked by near misses that felt intentional, as if the city itself were testing his resolve. He walked past a bus stop minutes after she had left it. He entered a grocery store as she exited through another door. Each missed connection sharpened his focus and his humility. Elena felt the weight of being found and not found at the same time. She sensed that something had shifted in the air, that the quiet she had chosen was no longer entirely hers to control. Still, she did not reach out. She believed that if he found her, it would have to be because he was ready to stand without armor. Alexander finally allowed himself one concession. He called a former colleague not to demand information, but to ask where people went when they started over. The answer was simple and infuriating: everywhere. That night he stood on a bridge and watched the river move beneath him, steady and indifferent. He understood then that searching was not a transaction. It was a commitment to vulnerability. Elena crossed that same river earlier that day, unaware of how close he was. Her thoughts focused on survival and the quiet strength she was building. She did not know he was learning to wait without entitlement. When Alexander finally spotted her, it was by accident and intention at once. He was leaving a corner store with nothing he needed when he saw her across the street, carrying groceries, hair pulled back, posture unchanged. He did not call out. He did not cross immediately. He stood still, letting the moment arrive on its own terms. She turned, sensing him, and their eyes met for a fraction of a second before a bus passed between them. When it moved on, she was gone. The loss hit him harder than any rejection. It taught him that finding her would not be about timing or persistence alone. It would be about becoming someone who could meet her without hiding. He walked home slowly, the city humming around him, aware that the search had already changed him. Power could open doors, guilt could chase him. Only humility would allow him to be seen. He did not know when he would find her, but he knew now how he had to look. They met without ceremony, without witnesses, without the kind of coincidence that felt like mercy. Elna was standing at the edge of a small neighborhood park grocery bag, set beside her watching a child struggle with a broken shoelace. She knelt to help out of habit, fingers moving with practiced care. When she stood, Alexander was there, a few steps away, hands at his sides, eyes fixed on her, like he was afraid she might vanish if he blinked. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city filled the space between them with distant sirens and passing traffic, ordinary sounds that felt unreal. Elena was the first to breathe. She straightened, nodded once, polite and distant as if greeting a stranger. Alexander felt the nod like a blow. He had imagined this moment endlessly rehearsed, apologies, explanations, confessions. None of them survived the reality of her calm. He said her name softly, not as a claim, but as acknowledgement. She did not correct him. She did not step closer either. They walked together to a nearby bench, the silence stretching without breaking. Alexander noticed everything he had trained himself not to notice before. The faint fatigue in her posture, the careful way she set her bag down to avoid crushing the bread, the absence of accusation in her expression. Shame rose in him, heavy and undeniable. He wanted to tell her he had looked everywhere, that he had learned how small the world felt without power. The words stayed lodged in his throat. Elena spoke first, asking if he was all right, the same way she used to, without drama or expectation. The kindness in her voice cut deeper than anger ever could. He nodded, unable to trust himself with more. Shame crowded out love, pressing him inward. He had built his life on being untouchable. Sitting beside her, he felt exposed. She listened while he spoke, in fragments admitting that he had not known how to face what she gave back to him. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not deserve it yet. Elena listened without interruption, her hands folded in her lap. When he finished, she did not fill the silence. She simply sat with it, allowing him to feel the weight of what he had done. The absence of judgment made the shame sharper. He realized then that love had not left him. It had been waiting, patient and unforgiving, until he was forced to see himself clearly. He reached out as if to touch her hand and stopped short, respect overriding impulse. The space between them mattered. Elena watched the hesitation and felt something loosen inside her chest. She had loved him once without expecting anything in return. Now she needed to see who he was, when expectation was removed entirely. She stood, picked up her bag, and told him she was glad he was alive. It was not a declaration. It was not an invitation. It was truth offered without attachment. Alexander stood as well, the loss already forming as she stepped back. He asked if they could talk again. She did not answer immediately. She looked at him for a long moment, searching for the man she had known and the man he might become. Finally, she said that honesty required time and time could not be rushed. Then she walked away. Alexander remained where he was, the bench empty beside him. Shame settling into something quieter and more instructive. He understood now that love could not survive without accountability, and accountability did not guarantee reunion. As Elena walked home, she felt the familiar ache of caring without certainty. She had not rejected him. She had not welcomed him back. She had chosen herself, and that choice felt like strength rather than loss. The meeting left them both changed, balanced between what had been and what might still be possible. Shame had met love and had not destroyed it, but it had refused to let love proceed unearned. That refusal lingered with Alexander. As he walked away, a question he could no longer ignore. The truth Alexander never said was not about ambition or fear of failure, but about fear of being known completely. He asked Elena to meet him again, not in a place that impressed anyone, but in a quiet public library where silence was expected and nothing could be performed. She arrived on time, carrying nothing but herself, and sat across from him at a long wooden table, scarred by years of use. He did not reach for her. He did not begin with apologies. He told her he wanted to speak without defending himself and asked if she would listen. Elena nodded, once her expression open but guarded. Alexander took a breath and began at the place he had always avoided. He told her that the night he changed his name was not only about survival, but about shame. He said he believed that the man he was back then was unworthy of love because he needed it too much. He said every time she looked at him with understanding, he felt exposed, and exposure felt dangerous. Elena listened, her hands folded, her eyes steady. He continued, admitting that success had become a substitute for intimacy. That power allowed him to be admired without being known. He said firing her had been easier than admitting she saw through him. The words came slowly, uneven at first, then steadier as he stopped trying to sound strong. He told her he had run because staying meant risking the one thing he never learned how to protect: connection. Elena felt the weight of his honesty settle into the space between them. It was not relief she felt, but recognition. This was the truth she had sensed without ever hearing. When he finished, he did not look away. He waited. Elena spoke carefully, not to soothe him, but to speak for herself. She told him that love had never been the problem. Fear had. She said she had accepted his silence because she thought it kept him safe. But safety without honesty had cost them both. She told him that listening now did not mean forgiving everything. It meant acknowledging that he was finally speaking without armor. Alexander nodded, accepting the distance that remained. He told her he was not asking her to return only to know that he had finally said what should have been said years ago. Elena considered him for a long moment, weighing the truth against the harm. She said that truth mattered, but so did time. She needed to see who he was when honesty required consistency, not confession. Alexander accepted this without argument. He understood that truth did not demand reward. As they stood to leave, he thanked her for listening, not as a plea, but as gratitude. Elena walked out, first leaving him among the quiet shelves. The truth he never said had finally been spoken, and it did not free him the way he once imagined. It grounded him instead, demanding responsibility. He left the library knowing that honesty was only the beginning. The public choice came to Alexander quietly. At first disguised as a routine obligation he could have delegated if he wanted to. The board meeting had been scheduled weeks in advance, an agenda packed with forecasts, risk assessments, and talking points polished to perfection. He entered the room knowing that what he was about to do would not fit any of them. The faces around the table were familiar, seasoned by years of profit and caution. They greeted him with nods that assumed alignment. Alexander took his seat and listened as reports rolled forward, numbers rising and falling like tides he once controlled without effort. When it was his turn to speak, he closed the folder in front of him and set it aside. He told them there would be a change in how the company operated, effective immediately. The room stilled. He explained that a termination had occurred under policy, but without judgment, and that policy alone was not enough. He said accountability required transparency, and transparency required him to address his own actions publicly. A director asked if this was necessary. Another reminded him of reputational risk. Alexander acknowledged the risks and continued. He stated that he would be stepping back from day-to-day control, while an independent review examined leadership practices and workplace equity. The words landed hard. Silence followed. Someone cautioned that markets would react. Alexander replied that markets always reacted, and that reaction could not be the measure of what was right. He explained that power insulated him from consequence, and that insulation had allowed harm to pass as procedure. He would not allow that to continue under his name. The board pressed him, asked for assurances, for limits, for timelines. He provided them calmly without defensiveness, aware that this choice would be read as weakness by some and as instability by others. He accepted that interpretation without correction. When the meeting adjourned, he left knowing the story would not stay contained. It never did. By afternoon, inquiries arrived. Reporters called. Analysts speculated. Alexander released a statement that said less than expected and meant more than most. He acknowledged fault without explanation. He outlined steps without grand language. He did not mention Elena by name. He did not frame himself as a hero. He chose clarity over control. Elena saw the news on a screen above a cafe counter while waiting for coffee. The headline did not dramatize it. It did not need to. She read the words slowly, aware of how exposed they made him. She felt no triumph, only a quiet recognition that he was doing the one thing she needed to see him do. Choose responsibility in front of others, not redemption in private. As the day unfolded, consequences followed. Stock dipped. Advisors urged reassurance. Colleagues questioned timing. Alexander stayed present. He answered what he could and refused what he could not justify. The company moved around him unsettled but functioning. That evening he walked through the city without an entourage, noticing the weight he no longer carried. He understood that choosing publicly did not guarantee forgiveness. It only proved intent. Elena finished her coffee and left the cafe, her steps measured. She did not reach out. She did not owe him validation. She allowed the choice to stand on its own. Across town, Alexander returned home to an apartment that felt unfamiliar without the illusion of certainty. He sat with the consequences he had accepted and found them heavy but honest. For the first time, the name he had buried did not feel like an accusation. It felt like a standard he had finally agreed to meet. The public choice had been made. What remained was whether it would be enough when no one was watching. Consequences did not arrive all at once. They unfolded in layers, each one quieter than the headlines, but heavier in its own way. Alexander felt them first in the small disruptions that used to be invisible. Meetings ended without his final word. Decisions paused instead of moving immediately. People spoke more carefully around him, not out of fear but uncertainty. The authority he had worn so effortlessly no longer functioned as a shield. He had invited scrutiny, and scrutiny had accepted. Advisors called daily with strategies to stabilize perception, to reassure investors, to soften language that sounded too much like fault. Alexander listened and declined most of it. He had chosen clarity, and clarity could not be managed into comfort. At Crow Tower, the atmosphere shifted. Employees whispered in hallways, some anxious, some quietly relieved. Policies were reviewed, procedures questioned, stories shared that had never reached upper floors before. The building felt more human and more unstable at the same time. Alexander walked through it, knowing he had set something in motion he could not control. That knowledge did not frighten him the way it once would have. It steadied him. Elena experienced the consequences differently. Without the structure of her old job, her days required new calculations. Money had to stretch. Hours had to be chosen carefully. She took temporary work cleaning offices that did not know her history and did not need to. The labor was harder without the familiarity she had built, but it was honest. No one expected her to disappear quietly anymore. She watched the coverage unfold from a distance, not searching it out, but not avoiding it either. Friends asked if she felt vindicated. She told them she felt tired. Vindication suggested an ending. This was not an ending. It was a middle that demanded patience. One evening, as Alexander walked home through a neighborhood he rarely visited, before a stranger recognized him and asked if he was the man who had stepped back from his own company. Alexander said yes. The stranger nodded, not impressed, not hostile, just curious. It struck Alexander then how much simpler interactions became when power was no longer the point. At the same time, doubt followed him. Late at night, he wondered if his choice had come too late, if accountability without reconciliation was an empty gesture. He resisted the urge to reach out to Elena, knowing that consequences were not meant to be eased by reassurance. Elena felt the distance as well. There were moments when she imagined him sitting alone, stripped of certainty, and she felt a pull toward compassion. She did not act on it. Compassion did not require proximity. She needed to see what remained when consequences settled. Days turned into weeks. The media moved on as it always did, but the internal shifts remained. Alexander learned to sit with discomfort instead of outrunning it. Elna learned that survival did not require silence anymore. One afternoon, she passed Crow Tower without stopping, aware of its presence without being drawn to it. Across the city, Alexander paused at a crosswalk and felt the same awareness, the knowledge that he might lose her again without ever knowing if he deserved another chance. Consequences had stripped both of them down to choice. What came next would not be forced by guilt or power, only by truth. Elena came to understand something she had always known, but never allowed herself to claim, that she had never truly been his maid, not in the way the word was meant to define her. The uniform had been a role, a permission to move quietly through a space that did not belong to her, but it had never described who she was. Without the tower dictating her hours, she rebuilt her days with intention. She accepted work that paid less but demanded honesty. She studied at night, revisiting skills she had set aside to survive. Each choice reminded her that independence was not abandonment, it was self-respect. When people asked about her past, she answered only what she chose to share. She did not explain herself to satisfy curiosity. The distance she placed between herself and Alexander was not punishment, it was protection. She needed to know that if he came back into her life, it would be because he saw her clearly, not because guilt demanded it. Alexander sensed the shift without being told. He noticed it in the way she no longer hovered at the edge of his thoughts as a question, but stood there as a boundary. He respected it even when it hurt. He followed the changes within his company from a step back, watching others make decisions, listening when he once commanded. The humility was not comfortable, but it was honest. He began to understand how much of his identity had been tied to being needed. Without that, he had to decide who he was when no one depended on him. The realization was unsettling and freeing at once. One afternoon, Elena crossed paths with someone who had worked in the same building years earlier. They spoke briefly, exchanged updates, and moved on. The conversation reminded her that her life had never been defined by proximity to power. She had been capable long before. She wore a badge that allowed her into restricted floors. That knowledge settled into her bones. She was not waiting for permission anymore. Alexander passed by the same building later that week, noticing the absence of routine where her presence used to soften his days. He did not interpret the absence as rejection. He understood it as a statement. She was choosing herself without asking him to witness it. That choice demanded respect. As weeks passed, Elena built a rhythm that belonged only to her. She found a small apartment closer to work, filled it with light, arranged it, without thinking about anyone else's preferences. In the quiet evenings, she reflected on the love she had carried and recognized that it had not diminished her. It had clarified her. Loving him without claim had been an act of strength, not sacrifice. She had not lost herself in that love. She had found her capacity to choose truth over comfort. Alexander felt the weight of that truth as well. In conversations with colleagues, he noticed how often he paused before speaking, how carefully he chose words that once came easily. The restraint was new. It reminded him that authority did not equal insight. Sometimes it only delayed it. He wondered if Elena could see the changes he was making without her. He did not reach out to ask. Growth was not something to advertise. It was something to sustain. One evening, Elena attended a small community event, nothing remarkable, just neighbors gathering to share space. She laughed easily, felt present, allowed herself to be seen without caution. In that moment, she realized she did not need to be reclaimed by anyone to be whole. The thought did not harden her toward Alexander. It softened her toward herself. Across the city, Alexander attended a meeting where his voice carried less weight than before. He listened more than he spoke and found that listening required courage. He thought of Elena then, not as someone he had lost, but as someone who had taught him how to stand without armor. The realization did not come with regret alone. It came with gratitude. Elena returned home that night and stood by her window, watching the city settle. She did not look for the tower. She did not measure her progress against the past. She felt grounded, self-directed present. She understood that if Alexander ever stood beside her again, it would not be as an employer or a savior. It would be as an equal. That understanding felt like freedom. Alexander reached the same conclusion from a different path. He accepted that wanting her back was not enough. Wanting required nothing. Becoming required everything. The truth that emerged between them was simple and unyielding. She was never his maid. She had always been herself. And if there was any future left to discover, it would begin there. Alexander chose the moment, carefully not for effect, but for honesty. There was no audience, no prepared speech, no setting designed to impress. He asked Elena if they could talk one last time, making it clear that she was free to say no. She agreed without expectation, meeting him in a quiet public square where people passed without paying attention. The simplicity mattered. When he arrived, he did not bring anything with him, no gifts, no gestures, no symbols that could be mistaken for leverage. They stood facing each other with the city moving around them, ordinary and indifferent. Alexander did not begin by explaining how much he had changed. He did not list the choices he had made or the costs he had accepted. He knew that accounting was not accountability. Instead, he did something that surprised even him. He lowered himself to one knee, not as a performance, not as a proposal, but as an act of clarity. The posture stripped him of height of dominance, of the distance he had once relied on. People passed and glanced and moved on. The world did not stop. Elna felt the shift immediately, not as shock, but as recognition. This was not the kneel of a man asking to be saved. It was the kneel of a man asking to be measured. Alexander spoke quietly, his voice steady. He told her he was not there to ask for love, forgiveness, or a future. He was there to acknowledge the harm he had caused and to say that he accepted whatever answer followed. He said he had confused control with safety and distance with strength, and that learning otherwise had cost him the illusion he once needed to survive. He told her he would continue choosing accountability, whether she was in his life or not. The kneel was not an offer, it was a statement. Elena listened, her hands at her sides, her heart steady. She did not rush to fill the silence. She allowed the moment to exist without interpretation. What mattered was not the position of his body, but the absence of demand in his words. She saw the difference between remorse that wanted relief and responsibility that expected none. When she spoke, her voice was calm. She told him that kneeling did not make him smaller. It made him visible. She told him she had never needed him to be powerful for her. She had needed him to be present and honest. She reminded him that choosing her now could not undo the years of absence, and that she would not pretend otherwise. Alexander nodded, accepting the boundary without argument. He told her he was not asking her to forget the past. He was asking for the chance to earn trust without shortcuts. Elena considered him the man before her and the man he had been. She did not reach out to lift him. She did not ask him to stand. She let him choose the moment to rise on his own. When he did, slowly and without ceremony, she met his eyes and saw no entitlement there, only patience. She told him that a chance was not a promise. It was an opening that required time, consistency, and humility. She said she would not step backward into what they had been. If there was a path forward, it would have to be built without haste. Alexander agreed without reservation. He thanked her for naming the terms, not because they benefited him, but because they respected her. They stood together for a moment, the space between them no longer charged with power or shame, only possibility held carefully. Elena felt the weight of choice settle comfortably in her chest. She had not been asked to rescue him. She had not been asked to forgive him prematurely. She had been asked to witness his commitment to change. That distinction mattered. As they parted, there was no embrace, no promise of what would come next. Only a shared understanding that humility had replaced fear, and that was a beginning worth acknowledging. Alexander walked away lighter, not because he expected an outcome, but because he had finally aligned his actions with his truth. Elena remained for a moment, longer watching the square return to its rhythm. She felt no rush to define what came next. The kneel had not secured love. It had made honesty possible. And that was enough to let her consider the question she had not allowed herself to ask before. Could she choose him again, not because he needed her, but because he was finally able to stand beside her without armor? The answer did not need to be immediate. It only needed to be real. The morning Elena finally spoke, the name aloud was quiet and unremarkable. The kind of morning that did not announce itself as an ending or a beginning. Sunlight filtered through the open window of her apartment resting on the table where 2 cups of coffee cooled untouched. Alexander sat across from her, hands relaxed shoulders, no longer held tight by vigilance. They had agreed to meet without expectations, to share space before sharing words. The city moved outside, distant and unconcerned, offering them the privacy of anonymity. Elena studied his face and noticed the absence of urgency there. He was no longer performing patience. He was practicing it. She thought of the years she had carried his silence and the months he had carried accountability. Neither had been easy. Both had changed them. She took a breath and spoke the name she had once guarded like a secret. Not softly this time, not as a weapon or a key, but as an acknowledgement. The sound of it settled into the room without violence. Alexander closed his eyes briefly, feeling the name land without tearing him open. It did not drag him backward. It did not demand penance. It simply existed connected to memory without dominating it. When he opened his eyes, he was smiling not in relief, but in recognition. That smile belonged to a man who no longer feared being seen. Elena felt something ease inside her chest. Saying the name no longer felt like crossing a line. It felt like returning something that had been misplaced. They spoke then about small things about work and routines and plans that did not extend far into the future. They avoided promises on purpose. What mattered was not what they said, but how they listened. There was no rush to reclaim time. There was respect for the space that had shaped them. Alexander told her that hearing the name now felt different, because it no longer threatened his sense of survival. He had learned that survival without honesty was only another form of loss. Elna listened and believed him, without surrendering herself to certainty. Belief she had learned could coexist with caution. They walked together afterward, not touching, letting the sidewalk set their pace. People passed without recognizing them, and that anonymity felt right. Love did not need witnesses, it needed choice. At a corner they stopped. Elena turned to him and told him that choosing him now did not erase the past. It honored it by refusing to repeat it. Alexander agreed, understanding that love was not a reward for growth, but a companion to it. He told her he was committed to continuing without guarantees. She nodded, accepting that commitment without binding herself to outcomes. They parted with a quiet understanding that whatever came next would be built deliberately without illusion. Elena returned home and stood by the window, the city familiar and new all at once. She felt no urgency to define the relationship she was stepping into. She felt grounded, present, and unafraid of her own voice. Speaking the name aloud had not diminished its power. It had transformed it. It was no longer a symbol of fear or loss. It was a reminder of a man who had chosen to return to himself. Alexander walked away with the same calm certainty. The name no longer felt like something he had to outrun. It felt like something he could carry without breaking. That evening, as lights came on across the city, both of them moved through their separate spaces with a shared sense of alignment. Love had not arrived as a grand declaration. It had arrived as a decision made repeatedly, quietly, and with respect. The story they were choosing did not need spectacle. It needed honesty sustained over time. Elena prepared dinner and set the table for one not as an act of loneliness, but of independence. Alexander returned to his apartment and opened the windows, letting air move freely through rooms that once felt sealed. The future remained undefined, and that uncertainty no longer frightened either of them. The name had been spoken aloud, not to reclaim the past, but to acknowledge the truth that had shaped it. What followed would be chosen day by day without armor, without claim, and without fear of being known. Love was no longer something they circled carefully. It was something they approached with intention. And that was enough. If this story stayed with you longer than you expected, it is because it was never really about wealth or power. It was about choice, about the moments when silence feels safer than truth, and about what happens when someone finally speaks anyway. Alexander and Elena are not perfect people. They are ordinary in the way most of us are ordinary. Afraid of being seen, afraid of losing what little stability we have built, afraid that love will cost more than we can afford. Many of us have been the person who ran because staying felt too dangerous. Many of us have been the person who waited quietly, hoping honesty would return on its own. This story asks a simple question that is not easy to answer. What would you do if the person you loved most reflected back the part of you that you tried hardest to erase? Would you listen or would you run again? Would you choose comfort or would you choose truth, even when it stripped you of control? Love in this story is not dramatic or loud. It is patient. It is restrained. It is built from accountability instead of promises. And that kind of love exists in real life more often than we admit. If you have ever loved someone without claiming them, if you have ever stayed silent to protect someone else, or if you have ever had to rebuild yourself after being invisible for too long, then this story was written for you. We would love to know what this story made you feel. Did you understand Elena's silence, or did you wish she had spoken sooner? Did Alexander's choices feel familiar, or frustrating, or painfully real? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let others see that they are not alone in these questions. If you are watching from somewhere in the United States, or from anywhere else in the world, tell us where you are watching from. Stories like this connect people who may never meet, but who recognize themselves in the same moments. If you enjoyed this kind of slow, emotional storytelling, consider subscribing to the channel so you do not miss the next story. Each story we share explores love loss and redemption in ways that feel grounded in real human experience. Before you go, take a moment to reflect. Is there a name in your life that still holds power over you? Is there a truth you have been waiting to speak or to hear spoken back to you? Sometimes healing begins not with grand gestures, but with a single honest word spoken at the right moment. Thank you for spending this time with us and for allowing this story to be part of your day. We believe stories matter because they remind us that growth is possible at any age and in any circumstance. If this story moved, you consider sharing it with someone who might need it today. A quiet reminder can change a difficult week. Your support helps this channel continue creating thoughtful stories that value emotion over spectacle. Let us know if you prefer stories like this, or if there is a theme you would like us to explore next. Your voice shapes what we create. Stay kind to yourself, stay curious about others, and remember that choosing honesty is often the bravest form of love. We appreciate every comment, every view, and every moment you share with us here. Your presence turns stories into conversations and makes this community meaningful. Thank you for being part of it. We truly value that always.